I visited Miss Havisham, wearing my new clothes. "I have been given a fortune since I last saw you, Miss Havisham," I said, "and I am so grateful." "I know," she replied, "and you have a good life ahead of you, but remember to follow Mr. Jagger's advice." She looked pleased as I said goodbye, and I felt sure that she was my secret benefactor. After all, Mr. Jaggers had told me that I was to be educated in London by Mr. Matthew Pocket, one of Miss Havisham's relatives. When I was sitting on the coach to London the next day, after a quick goodbye to Joe, my sister and Biddy, I felt as though the whole world was waiting for me. It was 5 long hours before I arrived at Mr. Jagger's office in London. His clerk, Mr. Wemmick, explained that because Mr. Jaggers was still at work, I should wait for him in his office. It was an unpleasant place, and I was sad that I had left the blacksmith's. When Mr. Jaggers returned, he said that I should go to my lodgings at Barnard's Inn, where I would share rooms with Mr. Matthew Pocket's son. He wanted to take me to his father's house in a few days' time, so that I could meet my new teacher. "Here is some money, Pip," Mr. Jaggers continued. "It is a lot of money, but don't worry, I will know how much you spend, in case there are any difficulties." This was good news. I felt happier now, and I agreed to go to my lodgings with Mr. Wemmick. He told me that Mr. Matthew Pocket lived in Hammersmith, 5 miles away. When we came to Barnard's Inn, I was disappointed. It looked dusty and gloomy. Mr. Wemmick left me at the door, but no one answered it. I thought that no one would come and let me in, but after about half an hour, I heard footsteps. A tall, thin young man appeared. "Mr. Pip?" he asked. "I am sorry. I went to buy some fruit at the market and I thought you would arrive later than this." He invited me in. It was only when he turned to speak to me in the light of the window that I saw who he was, the pale young gentleman. Herbert Pocket was the pale young man. He was not handsome, but his face was cheerful and I liked him at once. However, I had a strange feeling that he would never become rich. We immediately began talking. I discovered that Miss Havisham had once thought she might adopt Herbert, so she had invited him to visit her. That was on the day that I had met Herbert, and fought with him in the garden. After that visit, however, Herbert was not invited to Miss Havisham's again. "She didn't think I was suitable," Herbert told me, "but if she had adopted me, I would probably be rich now, and if that had happened, then I might even be Estella's fiancé too." "You must be disappointed," I said. "No, not at all," he replied. "I think I have had a lucky escape. Estella is proud and cruel. Miss Havisham adopted her, you know. She wants to use her, to take revenge on men." I was very surprised. Estella was adopted. Why did Miss Havisham want to use her in such a strange way? When we sat down to eat, Herbert continued to tell me about Miss Havisham. First, however, he told me how to behave at the dinner table, for which I was grateful. I soon discovered from Herbert that Mr. Jaggers was Miss Havisham's lawyer. Mr. Jaggers had suggested that Herbert's father, Mr. Matthew Pocket, should be my teacher in London. I was convinced now that Miss Havisham was my secret benefactor. Herbert told me more about Miss Havisham. He explained that when she was a young woman, she and her half-brother had inherited a fortune from their father. It was not long, however, before her half-brother spent his share of the money and became jealous of her. He wanted to have her money, and he started to think about how he could get it from her. He didn't care if he had to hurt her to get it. Soon afterwards, Miss Havisham got engaged. During this time, she gave most of her fortune to her fiancé. This was against the advice of her cousin, Matthew Pocket, who warned her not to trust her future husband too much. Miss Havisham became very angry with Matthew Pocket and ordered him to leave her house. He has never been there since. "Is your father still angry with Miss Havisham for ordering him to leave?" I asked Herbert. "No, he's not angry at all," replied Herbert. "But when Miss Havisham sent him away that day, she said that he wanted to get her money himself. If he visited now, it would look as if he still wanted her money." On the morning of the wedding, when everything was ready and the guests were expected, there was some bad news. Miss Havisham's fiancé had left her. She received the news at 8:20 in the morning while she was getting dressed. Ever since that time, more than 25 years ago, neither Miss Havisham nor her house had changed at all. Even the clocks in the house had been stopped. But why didn't Miss Havisham's fiancé marry her? I asked. He would have had all her property then. Perhaps he was already married, Herbert said. It seemed that the fiancé had, in fact, planned everything with Miss Havisham's half-brother, hoping to take as much money from her as they could. Nobody knew if the two men were still alive or not. The following day, I was taken to meet the Pocket family at their home in Hammersmith in West London. They lived by the river in an old house. When we arrived, we found Herbert's younger brothers and sisters playing noisily in the garden. Despite the place being very ordinary, it was a happy house, and I immediately felt comfortable there. Mr. Matthew Pocket and his wife were as cheerful as their son, and made me welcome. After they showed me my room, they introduced me to two other young men who were also staying there. We soon got to know each other very well. Startop was good-natured, but Bentley Drummle was proud and grumpy. I was learning how to live like a young gentleman and improving my education because I would be very rich one day. Mr. Jaggers gave me more money whenever I asked, which was quite often. I noticed, however, that he never laughed, and everyone seemed scared of him. One day, while waiting in Mr. Jaggers' office, I had a conversation with Mr. Wemmick about Mr. Jaggers' work. I noticed that Mr. Wemmick was proudly wearing a ring. He told me that it was a present from people he had worked with. I was invited to Mr. Wemmick's house. He lived with his father some distance from the centre of London, in a strange building that looked like a small wooden castle. Mr. Wemmick told me that all of London's criminals were afraid of Mr. Jaggers, so they left him alone. I learnt that Mr. Jaggers did not even lock his house at night, and often said, "I want to see the man who'll dare to rob me."